if you go back even to this quarter a year ago, the company was in the doghouse, and they were challenging to convince Wall Street that their long-term strategy to build for the future, all this metaverse focus, that was going to be the right thing to do, especially if the economy was starting to turn. So this quarter, in a lot of ways, does feel, Carol, a little bit like what we saw in the second quarter. They showed top line strength. They showed bottom line discipline. We've seen massive cost reductions. Headcount has come down dramatically since last November for the company. And so if they can grow their revenue at a time when they're sending a message to the street about costs being improved, it's a nice recipe. Now, I think the stock story is going to be an interesting one because you're right. We saw a lousy day for Alphabet. A lot of that had to do with the cloud business as opposed to the advertising business. So that looks pretty good right now. But I think you're going to hear a lot more of them pushing this message of AI, that AI can give their users more tools and keep engagement high, and that AI can also help advertisers get better engagement for their ads. I would imagine
Zuckerberg
you hear
calling
a lot
it
more about that again.
Yeah.
Mark Zuckerberg talking about it in the release, right?
Yeah, he referenced the new virtual reality headset. That's the Oculus Quest 3, and then those Ray-Ban smart glasses that they unveiled recently. Again, though, Jon, I go back to this over and over again. The company is called Meta because of the metaverse, and its name was changed for a reason. Reality Labs is expected to lose $3.94 billion this quarter. Talk to us about, a company that still gets more than 95% of its revenue from targeted ads.
Yeah, they're leaning into it. They're leaning into it because they plan to continue focusing on spending a lot of money to try to get that metaverse thing going. I mean, even if it's taking a backseat for now, to your point, Tim, they haven't changed the name back to Facebook. It is Meta. And, there's different components. Everything starts to fall into the same soup bowl on this. But I guess there's different components to what the metaverse ultimately might be. You talked about the Quest 3. There's a good example. Apple's got the Vision Pro. Quest 3 maybe is sort of the product for the rest of us, not as splashy, but something that kind of gets you into a world that the company thinks is going to be very important in the future. It's a costly world. They're building it. And so, again, after the lessons they learned last year, they said, okay, well, let's lean into the story of advertising for now. The challenge for them, I think, is that if you got a nice run up in the stock coming into the second quarter, and then you sort of had a very positive message for the second quarter, but the stock was already bumping near its highs of the year. And we had kind of gotten there as well recently. I mean, this is the second best performing stock this year behind NVIDIA. So you can say AI to maybe offset some of that spending that's going into things like Reality Labs right now. That's going to be interesting. It's hard to know whether or not, in the current environment, this earnings environment where really Netflix had a very strong positive reaction. Everybody else, it's a little bit more measured, and that might be just because we've seen such high expectations for this turnaround for Meta so far this year.
Well, and what's interesting, if you look at the stock reaction right after it came out, we did see the stock sell off a little bit, and then it bounced back, and so we do see it up still about 3.8%. But, Jon, I'm curious, with all this spending that they continue to kind of stick to build out the metaverse, whether or not investors at some point are going to maybe think a little bit more about, what that means ultimately in terms of profitability going forward.
I mean, I think the short-term strategy, Carol, at the company was, let's show how profitable we can be. And you literally just saw that in the third quarter results. They were very impressive. And the company showing that we can have that bottom line discipline if we want. Now, I would say sort of a side story to that is when you're talking about the expenses for next year, there does still seem to be a focus on the fact that they might have some. I mean, we'll still have to look at what exactly they said here, but I almost interpreted it as they had so many layoffs at the company that they have to get ready for some additional expenses tied to just making sure the staffing levels make sense for next year as well. It's a balancing act. It's a balancing act for the company. I think people would probably like to know, where the top line growth is coming from. On the product front, right? There's a lot of stale parts of this empire, but they've got Reels, which has done very well. They keep talking about, rolling out the Reels advertising playbook, that's been strong. I don't know if they're going to talk about Threads, but there was a lot
I
of fanfare
was
around
just
that
gonna go there,
X
Jon.
rival.
Yeah, this is the competitor. The competitor to Twitter, to X. Is there are they advertising on Threads yet?
Uh, no, I mean, they had a lot of fanfare. They were ready to roll it out. I remember when they launched it, they said this was a risk, and I think they felt very rewarded with the early traction that they got with it. But it certainly seems to have stalled out dramatically. And for a company that, let's face it, has had sort of some copycat measures in their history, I think they're going to try to talk a little bit less about threads, although we'll see, and talk a little bit more about the stuff that they've been able to emulate that is working. And that's why I keep going back to AI. It's like this balance between, yes, they are still committed to making their virtual reality goggles work, to sort of sell this long-term story of the metaverse. But the AI, it's just an easier sell right now when they've already been able to implement some of this into their products. They had ChatGPT envy, let's face it. And so they can talk, and I'm sure they'll continue to talk because some of their senior people are all over this, about ways by which you can interact with more AI chatbots, and they can introduce more generative AI tools within their existing social media products. Keep the engagement levels at reasonable levels to satisfy the advertisers. But if this is the one company that always had great ad tech, ad tools, and I think if we're going to compare them, let's say to Twitter or X, that was one of the things that they were always much better at doing. So your point, Tim, I guess if they could get to the point where they could put advertising on threads, they'd be able to really flex some muscle, but they'd like to see, I'm sure, the product do a little bit better before they do that.
I got to say, in this release, there's a lot about, total expenses, restructuring costs, facilities consolidation charges, and severance and other personnel costs.
Carol, it's the year of efficiency. Mark Zuckerberg said it.
But then there's also, talking about, Reality Labs a lot, and just like the build out and capital expenditure. So it is an interesting year. And I guess ultimately, John, we will see what 2024 brings in terms of this shift and whether or not it ultimately starts to pay off, or whether, investors have to be a little patient in terms of the impact of this. Many would say, right? I mean, before this all pays off, the metaverse, it's going to take a while, right?
Yeah, and I think if you look at the next 10 years, I think people think form factors will change. I think a lot of people think that we won't necessarily spend as much time on our phone if there's a better way of doing things. But that can be messy in the short term and costly, right? And so if you dealt with what you dealt with last year as Mark Zuckerberg, your ego gets a little bruised. You bring down the hammer. You show everybody that you're back to those financial, quarterly results that we got used to in the past before the recent slowdown.
Right.
And then you get back on that train and try to spend and see what happens.